Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel F1 Aerodynamicist, where I talk about F1 careers, F1 aerodynamics and race weekend analysis, although that's still work in progress. Well, today we're going to talk about something really interesting. We're going to talk about what can you expect as you go into your aerodynamicist interview. Yes, it's happening finally. So if you're serious of becoming an aerodynamicist, watch till the end and let's dive into it then. So having answered interviews for top aerospace companies such as Bell, Boeing and Airbus, and then top F1 teams and motorsport brands, I can give you an idea of what your interview might look like into the future. Obviously, I cannot give out specifics and questions because that would be unethical and unprofessional from my end. But this video and the purpose of this video is to kind of give you an idea of what you might expect depending on what CV you've presented. So that's the philosophy that we're going to carry, right? So I'm going to go over some of the fundamentals, some of the aero bits that you can be asked, questions regarding CFD in wind tunnel. Then I'm going to go over my projects, and keeping my projects in mind, what kind of questions can I be asked which are related to the fundamentals, and also my work experience, again connecting them to the fundamentals. Then I'm going to go over my formula student projects and how and what kind of questions can be asked to you during your interview, and what I've been also asked in the past, a little bit of experience into it. And then some of the famous interview questions where I can go bazooka, because that is public information, so I can talk all about that. So let's get on to the fundamentals to begin with. So to begin with, as I discussed in some of my previous videos, in an interview, you'll normally find two kind of people. One, who talk about your experience and try to connect it to fundamental. And second, who do not give a damn about what your experience is and are just going to ask you fundamental questions and are going to try to break you down into that interview. So you need to know your fundamentals really, really well, especially if you're going for a graduate role or a student placement role in an F1 team or in a top aerospace company. So obviously, the first things that come to mind are the fundamentals of fluid mechanics. So your mass and momentum conservation equation. And this might seem quite silly to some of y'all, but you need to be able to explain these equations in a 3D sense. And what do they mean in a 3D sense? Very important. I've been caught out with it. And then jumping onto the Navier-Stokes equation, which is a form of, a momentum equation. But you should be able to classify each and every term. First of all, write it down in any form that you want, but then able to explain what each term is in terms of pressure, the diffusion bit, the advection bit, and what you understand from these terms. I've been asked in a lot of interviews, can you explain me the Navier-Stokes equation and why it is formed the way it is formed? So have a good understanding of what that equation is trying to say, and also an understanding of why it is still unsolved. It's really important. Sometimes people ask, okay, why is this equation still $1 million equation, right? Because there's a prize money on it. So try and understand that bit too. Then people love to ask you questions related to Bernoulli equation, especially applicative questions, which you might have studied in your graduate or your master's or during your master's. And then they try to ask you where and when can Bernoulli equation be useful and be used, and where it cannot be used. So you should be able to tell them the limitations of the Bernoulli equation. Yes, that you can only apply it along a streamline and stuff like that. So make sure you kind of freshen those bits up too. And then the big giant, the boundary layer theory. People love to grind you on the boundary layer theory, because you should be able to understand how vorticity and shear layers are connected to boundary layer. You should be able to explain separation, the phenomena of separation that we all study during our basic boundary layer module, and how that happens in terms of adverse pressure gradients, favorable pressure gradients, and what do these terms really mean. You should be able to talk about displacement thickness and its role in potential flow solvers, which again is fundamental in terms of how you think about simplifying the aerodynamics and starting to mathematically model it, which are the foundations. And then the big boy, vortex dynamics, the three fundamental laws of vortex dynamics, what are the assumptions, where can they be applied, and some like physical explanations of where you can see them. You can talk about, additionally, you can really impress somebody if you know topics regarding vortex merging and vortex strength, and how vortex health is kind of dependent, and what factors vortex health is dependent on. These are some topics that not usually a lot of people know, but if you can speak about it somehow during your interview, that's definitely going to leave a good impression, especially with interviews regarding motorsport or F1, because you know everything is vortex dominated. So having an understanding of vortex dynamics really helps you out. And then you kind of go into more aerodynamic related modules, that you know, thin aerofoil theory and finite wing theory. So in thin aerofoil theory, you should be able to portray an understanding of 2D aerodynamics, in the sense of, you know, all your CL alpha plots, all the aerodynamic plots that you normally study about, what is stall, and how does the magic 2 pi number come about. And then when you jump into finite wing theory, you should be able to talk about how the 2D formulation of an aerofoil can be then taken forward to design a wing of a given shape, and how do the wing shape parameters affect the performance of that wing, you know, like the effect of aspect ratio, sweep angle, dihedral angles, a selection of aerofoil, twist distribution, lift distribution, and even like 3D vortex structures, and how do they affect your lift distribution, and how can you minimize them, for example using winglets. So people try to test you on these concepts, and make sure you have your fundamentals right. An easy way to answer the question, are my fundamentals right, or how much is enough, is simply to ask yourself why, and why to every answer of a particular question. And if you can go to like 3 levels of why, then you can pretty much tell yourself that, okay, your fundamentals are quite strong. So that's a quick thumb rule for you all. 3 levels of why, if you can answer that, you're pretty good. And then jumping onto CFD related roles, or even general aerodynamic CFD topics, you know, people start asking you about turbulence models. What is turbulence modeling? Why is it important in your Navier-Stokes equation? If you've mentioned some CFD related projects, which we often do, they ask you why the K epsilon model, why the K omega model, and what are the advantages and disadvantages? What is the mathematical formulation of these models? What are the meshing strategies that you've used for those specific models, and why you had to use them? If you've done projects related to motorsport, then they ask you about how did you capture the wake of the tire, how did you capture the behavior of the ground and the interaction of the ground and the lower part of the car. So these are very specific questions that you might be asked depending on what projects you talk about. And then of course, what is the idea of discretization? That is, why do you need discretization, and how does it help you from a mathematical perspective, you know, breaking down this complex differential equations or vector equations into something that are linear algebraic equations. So how does that happen? If you have an understanding of that, that's really going to help you out. And why do you have to use certain kind of solvers for certain problems, or what solver did you use for your problem and why did you use that? So having an understanding of these basic things is like really important. And then if you speak about wind tunnel experience or wind tunnel modules, and people start by asking you what is the Reynolds number similarity, just to see if you know anything about wind tunnels. And then they ask you about how do you kind of go about turbulence similarity. So you need to talk about turbulence intensity and all these kind of factors which try to match turbulence to real life situations in the wind tunnel. So know this stuff. What are the limitations of wind tunnel? Very, very important, because people believe wind tunnel is an ideal world sometimes, or they expect you to believe that your wind tunnel is an ideal world. So you should clearly be able to highlight the limitations of a wind tunnel in terms of the blockage ratio, in terms of the dissimilarity of Reynolds numbers, in terms of when it comes to motorsports, the boundary layer that is grown on the ground, and how do you take care of these limitations, or how do you at least try to take care of these limitations? The effect of temperature can also change your results, and how important it is to calibrate instruments, which can also give you faulty results sometimes. So try and have an understanding of this, and especially when it comes to F1, what is rebalancing, like the concept of rebalancing for an update in terms of efficiency, redragging, and how do you evaluate whether an option is actually good on the car or not in the global picture. And then what is aero mapping, and why do you want to do aero mapping in a wind tunnel compared to a CFD environment? So this kind of questions normally pop up during interviews, and so make sure you kind of have them covered. Yeah, so let's get into some project specific questions. So I'm going to go on to some projects that I've done and then some of the questions that I've been asked on it. So when it came to my initial career, one of the projects that I had was the SAE Aero competitions that we used to go in, which was primarily low Reynolds number challenge. So the idea was, how did you select, so the idea was, you designed a UAV and you flew it through a track, and the competition criteria was highest payload fraction. So people would ask me questions like, okay, so tell us something specific related to low Reynolds number, and how is it different from how is the physics different from the normal airplanes? How did you select your aerofoil, and why did you select those aerofoils? Like, tell us some of the phenomena which are specific to low Reynolds number and not to high Reynolds number. So you would dive into details of those and how manufacturing limitations kind of also chose and drove decisions, and how did we try and achieve the highest payload fraction. And then when it came to my bachelor thesis, can't talk much about it because it was for the Indian defense. So the idea was, I worked on this micro UAV called Pushpak, and the idea was to develop modular winglets onto this UAV so that it could extend its range and reduce its stall speed so that it could take like spy pictures of the enemy. Well, I am proud to say that we did quite a good job on it, and we were able to achieve our results. But the idea was, again, low speed aerodynamics, stability and control issues, and what is the idea of adding winglets, and how does it help you reach your targets. So you should be able to explain fundamentals like this about your project. And then it came to Bell flight. I worked on the Bell 525 helicopter and the Bell Nexus air taxi. So on the 525, I mostly did drag studies in terms of trying and reducing the drag, and how we can kind of include upgrades as the program was developing. And we also tried to tackle some of the aerodynamic problems that we had on the 525, which I can't speak about, but the idea was that there was a vortex from somewhere hitting something, and the idea was, how can we get rid of that in certain flight conditions. So worked on that, quite interesting. So again, you're touching on to topics of vortex bursting, vortex health, vortex strength, and what's driving those, and how can you reduce vortex trajectory, and how can you influence that with different pressure differentials. So you can talk about these kind of stuff when you are in an interview. When it came to Bell Nexus air taxi, we were still in the configuration stage, so we were still deciding how many props do we use, how many ducted rotors do we use, and where do we place them. So it was a configuration study, very preliminary design analysis, as we so say. So what was really interesting and unique about that study was you learned the interaction of ducted rotors and also rotors mounted on airplane wings, and how it augments lift in a slightly different way. So if I was in an interview, like and I would talk about this, then I would talk about some of the things that I learned during my time working on this project, and how there's this new technology coming up in which you can augment lift on top of a wing using a ducted rotor. Quite cool stuff. Check out the AIAA papers on this if you're interested in more air taxi related stuff. Well, then going into Formula student experience, it was quite interesting because I worked on the front wing for the first time during my Formula student experience. And a lot of the questions that I've been asked around this are normally related to fundamentals like draw the CP distribution of a multi-element airfoil and tell me how it works. The way you draw a CP distribution, by the way, can talk a lot about you, because you have to mention that CP distribution is for what angle of attack, and the way you draw your pressure side, the way you draw your suction side, depending on the example aerofoil that you've drawn, can speak a lot about what are your fundamentals like. And if you say, okay, if I take that distribution and if I bring it in ground effect, for example, what happens if I take it away from ground effect? What happens to the CP distribution? Quite interesting questions these are, which normally you can be asked. So think about it. You might not find answers to these questions, but have a thought process, because in a lot of the times people think that you need right answers for interviews, but what you actually need to show is a thought process. You might be wrong, but if you're thinking logically and through fundamentals, people really appreciate that. So keep that in mind. I got asked a lot of like, what is this vortex structure for? And you have to talk about tire squirt and how that impacts the performance of your floor. We're talking about controlling the separation point of the tire by using the top edge vortex and how that affects. You talk about front wing philosophies in terms of outwashing, inwashing concepts, and how they influence the tire wake when you work with Formula student stuff. And then like strakes, that used to be a thing underneath the front wings, and how powerful they are, and how they can be the upside or the downfall of your entire front wing concept. So when you start talking about these kind of things, especially with F1 teams, they immediately know that you're talking in the same language, and that's really all about it. Can you talk at the same language as what people expect you to? And then I did a lot of correlation activities when I was in Formula student. So making sure that our track model, our CFD model is kind of giving us consistent results, like within a 10% accuracy. So we tried we did qualitative analysis by using Tufts to see if there were any apparent separations, doing slow-mos of videos on non-windy days. So obviously you need to know the advantages and the backdraws of such kind of a test, and that is what people will normally question you about. And then we also invested time into trying and understanding what is the attitude of the car as it goes through a track, through low speed corners, through medium speed corners, and through high speed corners. And if those are the similar attitudes that we were simulating in our simulations, or what is the range of parameters such for ride height, for roll, for pitch, that we need to model for in our simulations, so that we can get realistic results which we feed into our vehicle dynamics simulations, for example. So how did you kind of derive those parameters, and what was the process that you went through to get to those values, is again something quite important. And I've been asked questions regarding this all the time. And when it came to something specific to CFD, it's normally like, what are the strategies that you use to capture the wake of the tire? What meshing criteria did you use? What turbulence model did you use? And why did you use those turbulence models? Again, when it comes to CFD, people love to question you about turbulence models and your meshing strategies, because that is fundamental for you believing on any CFD results. And now we can finally talk about the famous interview questions. So I'm going to leave some of the links in the description below that might help you to answer some of these questions. So let's dive into the questions. I can bazooka them because they are available online, so I can have any opinion I want on them. So aero setup for, say, Monaco versus Spa. So obviously your brain must have lit up right now and know, okay, for Monaco we need dirty downforce, for Spa we need efficiency. So stuff like this, you should be able to talk about efficiency and what it actually means aerodynamically, and how you have factors playing in, and how can you improve efficiency of a car, which are the major elements of the car which produce drag, and stuff like that. In Monaco, what are its challenges of the track, and why you only need dirty downforce on that track to make things go faster, or at least to have the fastest lap time. What creates lift? Fundamentalists love this question. There are a lot of resources online that kind of give you bad answers, and if you give a bad answer to this question, you're pretty much out of the park when it comes to this interview. So make sure there's one question answer to really, really well. Why do we need downforce? At this point, you should be able to talk about what is the effect of downforce on the car, and why it allows the car to go faster around corners. Give an example about, for example, if you just add 100 kilos of weight on the car versus 100 kilos of downforce onto the car, what effect it has on the car as it goes through a corner, and why downforce is like a magical force that everybody is looking after, as long as you balance it out equally on both the excels. And where are aero forces most important? This is a question if you kind of get into a detailed discussion with respect to F1 cars. So people might ask you, okay, so what does the front wing do, and what is it responsible for most importantly? So you should be able to talk about how the front wing has a crucial role in terms of balancing the car, how it is has a big role in terms of how you distribute air to the rest of the car, and how the rest of the car's performance is highly dependent on how your front wing design, and that is kind of makes what makes the whole thing complicated, right? And then you can kind of dive into how the floor works. So you should be able to talk about the diffusers and how a diffuser works fundamentally, why vortex systems are very important in a diffuser and is literally the fundamental of how a diffuser works. And you should be able to talk about the rear wing, and that it's the most drag producing bit on the car, and it's really important for balance and also for efficiency. So that's why you see like different rear wing levels as you go to different tracks requiring different efficiency targets. So talk about this, have an idea about this, especially if you go for an F1 interview. And then the famous question, can an F1 car drive upside down? I've heard Mercedes really likes this question, and of course most of the people would answer only regarding counter the weight, the velocity at which you counter the weight of the car, like you produce enough downforce to generate the weight of the car, is the amount of downforce required, and technically an F1 car can do that. But hey, you need to also account the extra downforce that you need to maintain the traction on the wheels as the car goes upside down to overcome the drag. So research about this question. Again, the objective is to have a discussion with your interviewer about the possible factors that you need to account for, and not only the obvious ones. So make sure you've prepared for this question. And then the trade-off between downforce and drag. So interviewers also like to ask questions regarding, give me examples where drag is more important versus downforce and vice versa. And you should be able to explain them with examples of tracks about these cases. And then why is the front wing more effective in balance and the rear wing in drag? Again, this comes to your fundamental understanding of how the aerodynamics of an F1 car is, and what is the importance of balance versus what is the importance of drag, and on what kind of tracks this is useful. So again, these questions are online based, so take them with a pinch of salt. They're not a hack, and they're not going to be exactly asked for you in your interview. But this video, like the philosophy of this video, is to give you an idea of what you can expect as you go into your aerodynamicist interview, and where do these questions rise from, your CV. So make sure you write your CV really well, because it's a conversation before a conversation with the person who's going to interview. So he's going to come with a particular mindset by looking at your CV. So make sure whatever you write in your CV, you can nail that down, especially in the form of your answers. So yeah, this was my humble attempt of giving you an insight into how your aerodynamicist interview might look like. Again, this ain't no hack. So make sure you prepare for your interview really well, but also make sure that you at least know the answers to these questions that I've discussed, and let me know if they help you out. And if you want to have like a mock interview with me, I might just be able to do that depending on my schedule. So do write me an email at formula1.aerodynamicist@gmail.com. The address is in the description below also. Hopefully this video has earned your like and also the subscribe. So I'm looking forward to listening to your thoughts about this video in the comments down below. Again, I enjoyed this one. I hope you did. This is F1 Aerodynamicist.